travelers left early the next morning. Bass tended to their needs, explaining his master's knee was swollen quite badly, and he didn't feel up to taking the stairs so early in the day. Everyone understood except for the sandy-haired merchant's son, who was too groggy to understand much of anything. The guards exchanged smiles and rolled their eyes while the tinker gave an impromptu sermon on the subject of temperance. Bass recommended several unpleasant hangover cures. After they left, Bass tended to the inn, which was no great chore, as there were no customers. Most of his time was spent trying to find ways to amuse himself. Sometime after noon, Coke came down the stairs to find him crushing walnuts on the bar with a heavy leather-bound book. "Good morning, Reshi." "Good morning, Bast," Cote said. "Any news?" "The Orison boys stopped by. Wanted to know if we needed any mutton." Cote nodded, almost as if he had been suspecting the news. "How much did you order?" Bast made a face. "I hate mutton, Reshi. It tastes like wet mittens." Cote shrugged and made his way to the door. "I've got some errands to run. Keep an eye on things, will you?" "I always do." Outside the Waystone Inn, the air lay still and heavy on the empty dirt road that ran through the center of town. The sky was a featureless gray sheet of cloud that looked as if it wanted to rain, but couldn't quite work up the energy. Cote walked across the street to the open front of the smithy. The smith wore his hair cropped short and his beard thick and bushy. As Cote watched, he carefully drove a pair of nails through a scythe blade's collar, fixing it firmly onto a curved wooden handle. "Hello, Caleb." The smith leaned the scythe up against the wall. "What can I do for you, Mr. Cote?" "Did the Orson boys stop by your place, too?" Caleb nodded. "They still losing sheep?" Cote asked. "Actually, some of the lost ones finally turned up. Torn up awful by practically shredded." "Wolves?" Cote asked. The smith shrugged. "It's the wrong time of year, but what else could it be? A bear?" "I guess they're just selling off what they can't watch over properly, them being short-handed and all." "Short-handed?" "Had to let their hired man go 'cause of taxes, and their oldest son took up the king's coin early this summer. He's off fighting the rebels in Manat now." "Menaras," Cote corrected gently. "If you see their boy again, let him know I'd be willing to buy about 3 halves." "I'll do that." The smith gave the innkeeper a knowing look. "Is there anything else?" "Well," Cote looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I was wondering if you had any wrought iron lying around," he said, not meeting the smith's eye. "It doesn't have to be anything fancy, mind you. Just plain old pig iron would do nicely." Caleb chuckled. "I didn't know if were going to be stopping by at all. Old Cobb and the rest came by a day before yesterday." He walked over to the workbench and lifted up a piece of canvas. "I made a couple extras, just in case." Cote picked up a rod of iron about 2 feet long and swung it casually with one hand. "Clever man." "I know my business," the smith said smugly. "You need anything else?" "Actually," Cote said as he settled the bar of iron comfortably against his shoulder, "there is one other thing. Do you have a spare apron and a set of forage gloves?" "Could have," Caleb said hesitantly. "Why?" "There's an old bramble patch behind the inn." Cote nodded in the direction of the Waystone. "I'm thinking of tearing it up so I can put in a garden next year. But I don't fancy losing half my skin doing it." The smith nodded and gestured for Cote to follow him into the back of the shop. "I've got my old set," he said as he dug out a pair of heavy gloves and a stiff leather apron. Both were charred dark in places and stained with grease. "They're not pretty, but they'll keep the worst of it off you, I suppose." "What are they worth to you?" Cote asked, reaching for his purse. The smith shook his head. "A jot would be a great plenty. They're no good to me or the boy." The innkeeper handed over a coin, and the smith stuffed it into an old burlap sack. "You sure you want to do it now?" the smith asked. "We haven't had rain in a while. The ground will be softer after the spring thaw." Cote shrugged. My granddad always said that fall's the time to root up something you don't want coming back to trouble you. Coat mimicked the quaver of an old man's voice. Things are too full of life in the spring months. In the summer, they're too strong and won't let go. Autumn, he looked around at the changing leaves on the trees. Autumn's the time. In autumn, everything is tired and ready to die. Later that afternoon, Coat sent Bass to catch up on his sleep. Then he moved listlessly around the inn, doing small jobs left over from the night before. There were no customers. When evening finally came, he lit the lamps and began to page disinterestedly through a book. Fall was supposed to be the year's busiest time, but travelers were scarce lately. Coat knew with bleak certainty how long winter would be. He closed the inn early, something he had never done before. He didn't bother sweeping, the floor didn't need it. He didn't wash the tables or the bar, none had been used. He polished a bottle or two, locked the door, and went to bed. There was no one around to notice the difference. No one except Bast, who watched his master and worried and waited.